I made a mistake with my son-in-law, and I've spent a long time trying to figure out exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the Christmas we let him sit at the head of the table because he asked to. Maybe it was when we paid for the rehearsal dinner and never once heard a thank you. Or maybe it was earlier than that, the first time he looked at my house and said, "You must have done well for yourself." The way you'd say it to someone you were sizing up, not someone you were grateful to know. His name is Trevor. My daughter's name is Ingrid. She was 31 when they got married, and I remember thinking she looked so happy standing at the altar at St. Andrew's in Collingwood that I didn't let myself notice how Trevor looked. Not at her, around, at the venue, at the guests, calculating something. I'm 64. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the province of Ontario, and before that, I drove a plow truck winters to get through university. My wife, Helen, passed 6 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. When she died, she left behind a small policy, some RRSPs, and a house in Barrie that had gone up considerably in value over the years. She also left behind Ingrid and a son, our boy Joel, who lives out in Kelowna now and calls every Sunday without fail. Helen and I were not flashy people. We drove sensible cars. We vacationed in the Maritimes. We did not talk about money at dinner, ever. That was a rule in our house. Not because we were ashamed of what we had, but because Helen's parents had nothing, and she never wanted anyone sitting at our table to feel the distance between themselves and us. I kept that rule after she died. That was my mistake. After the wedding, Trevor and Ingrid rented a condo in Oakville, which was already a stretch on their combined income. Trevor worked in commercial real estate, not selling, coordinating, which is a different and less lucrative thing. Ingrid was a speech pathologist with a regional school board. They made decent money together, not condo in Oakville money, but decent. I helped them with first and last, $2,200 each, a few months apart. I didn't think twice about it. That's what you do. 2 years later, Ingrid called to tell me they were thinking about buying. I said that was wonderful. She said they'd found a place. I asked where. Oakville, she said. On the 16-Mile Creek side. I looked it up after we hung up. The listing was $1.4 million. Now, I want to be clear about something. I have savings. After 31 years with the province, I have a pension. After Helen died, I consolidated, paid off the house, invested carefully. I am comfortable. I will be fine in retirement. I know this. But I am not a wealthy man in the way Trevor seemed to think I was, and more importantly, even if I were, what I had was mine. It was meant to last me another 25 years if I was lucky. It was not a fund Trevor could draw on whenever he needed to close a gap between the life he wanted and the life he could actually afford. I didn't say any of that on the phone. I said the place sounded lovely and asked when they were planning to move. 3 weeks later, Trevor called me directly. Not Ingrid, Trevor. I wanted to talk to you man to man, he said, which should have told me everything. He explained the situation the way a contractor explains a quote, methodically, with numbers. The house was 1.4. They had 230 saved. They needed a minimum of 5% down plus closing costs, which they could technically cover, but the mortgage payments would be close to $7,000 a month, and with property tax and maintenance they were looking at 8.5. That's a lot, I said. It is, he said. That's why we were hoping you might consider coming in as a co-investor. I asked him what that meant. He said he'd done some research. If I contributed $250,000 toward the purchase, they could bring the mortgage down to a manageable level. He called it an investment because he said the property would appreciate and I'd essentially be building equity. He'd had a lawyer draft a simple agreement, he said. I sat with the phone against my ear and looked out my kitchen window at the backyard where Ingrid used to chase fireflies in the summer. I thought about Helen. I thought about what she would say. Trevor, I said, I need to think about this. Of course, he said, take your time. But his voice said something different. His voice said, this is a formality. I called Joel that evening. He's a careful thinker, my son. He didn't say anything for a long moment after I explained it, and then he said, Dad, what do Maureen and Ted think about all this? Maureen and Ted are Trevor's parents. They live in Burlington. Ted sold his plumbing business a few years back. They are not struggling. I told Joel I didn't know what Maureen and Ted thought because Trevor hadn't mentioned them. Joel said, that tells you something. It did. But I loved my daughter, and so I spent the next 2 weeks trying to talk myself into it. I called a financial advisor I'd been with for years, a woman named Cheryl who has never told me what I wanted to hear, only what I needed to. She pulled up my accounts and my pension projections, and she looked at me across the desk and said, "If you give them 250, and the market does what it's been doing, and you need memory care in 15 years, you will be choosing between your medication and your rent. Is that what you want?" It was not what I wanted. I called Ingrid and asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us. She came to Barry on a Thursday. I made the lemon chicken she always liked. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her, as gently as I knew how, that I couldn't do it. I said I loved her. I said I wanted her to be happy. I said I was worried about my own future, and I did not think it was responsible for me to take on that kind of exposure at my age. She nodded. She looked at her plate. She said, "Trevor's not going to take this well." I said I understood. She drove home, and by 9 o'clock that evening Trevor was on the phone, and he was not talking to me man to man anymore. He was angry in that cold, controlled way that is actually worse than shouting. He said I had led them to believe I would help. He said they'd already put in an offer. He said that because of my decision they might lose their deposit. I told him I had never agreed to anything. He said I had implied it. We went back and forth. I stayed as calm as I could. At the end, he said something I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "You have more than enough. You're just choosing not to share it with your own family." I didn't answer. I hung up. The deposit was $40,000. They lost it because the deal fell through when the financing didn't work without my contribution. I heard about this through Ingrid in a text 2 days later. No commentary, just the facts. For a month, I barely heard from her. Trevor went completely silent. Joel called, and I told him what had happened, and he said, "Dad, you did the right thing." I appreciated that, but it didn't make the silence easier. Then, on a Tuesday in late October, I received a registered letter. I want to describe exactly what it felt like to open that envelope at my kitchen table, in the house where I raised my children, in the town where I coached minor hockey for 9 seasons, where I'd served on the library board, where my wife was buried. My son-in-law was suing me. The claim alleged that I had made a verbal promise to contribute $250,000 toward the purchase of a property, that my daughter and he had relied on that promise to their detriment, and that as a result of my failure to fulfill it, they had suffered financial damages, including the lost deposit of $40,000 and consequential losses related to the collapse of the transaction. The total claimed was $380,000. I read the document 3 times. Then I called Joel. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, he sued our father. I called a lawyer the next morning, a litigation solicitor in Barrie named Clifford, who has the kind of calm that comes from having seen everything. He read the claim and leaned back in his chair and said, "This is thin. Do you have anything in writing suggesting you agreed to contribute?" I did not. "Did you ever transfer any money?" I had not. "Did you sign anything?" No. He said the legal concept they were relying on was something called promissory estoppel, the idea that someone can be held to an informal promise if another party relied on it to their detriment. He said it was a real legal doctrine, but it required proof, and proof was going to be difficult to establish on a conversation. "We'll respond to the claim," he said, "and we'll be just fine." The months between receiving the claim and the hearing date were the strangest of my life. I went about my routine. I walked the dog, a yellow lab named Buddy, that Helen picked out the year before she got sick. I had breakfast at the Tim Hortons on Dunlop on Tuesday mornings with a group of retired guys I've known for years. I called Joel on Sundays. I raked the leaves. I did not tell anyone outside of Joel and Clifford what was happening, because I was ashamed, not of what I'd done, but of having a life in which this was happening. Ingrid called me once, in November. She said she was sorry. I asked if she had tried to stop it, and she said it had already been filed by the time she knew. I believed her. I still believe her. She sounded exhausted. I asked her, carefully, whether Maureen and Ted had been asked to help with the house. There was a long pause. "Trevor said there was no point asking them," she said. "They always say no." I sat with that. The hearing was in February at the Superior Court in Barrie. I wore the suit I'd worn to Helen's funeral because it's the only good suit I have, and because I thought, obscurely, that she should be with me for this. Trevor and Ingrid sat at the plaintiff's table with a young lawyer I didn't recognize. Ingrid didn't look at me when I came in. Trevor looked at me steadily, with that same assessing quality I'd noticed years ago at the wedding. Clifford had prepared me for what to expect. The plaintiff would need to establish that a clear and unambiguous promise had been made, that they had relied on it, and that the reliance was reasonable. Their evidence was Trevor's account of our phone conversation and a series of text messages between Ingrid and Trevor, in which she told him, based on our dinner conversation, that she thought I was open to helping. That was their case. That Ingrid had inferred I was open to helping. When I took the stand, I told the truth. I said I had told Trevor I needed to think about it. I said I had never agreed to anything. I said I had told Ingrid directly that I could not contribute. I said no money had ever changed hands. The judge, a woman about my age with reading glasses pushed up on her head, looked at the file for a moment, and then looked at Trevor's lawyer. "Counsel," she said, "your clients made an offer on a $1.4 million property without securing written confirmation of a third-party financial commitment. Is that correct?" The lawyer said that was correct, but that the promise had been verbal. She looked at Trevor. She said, "Sir, at any point before you submitted that offer, did you ask your father-in-law to put his commitment in writing?" Trevor said he had not. She said, "Why not?" He didn't have a good answer. He said something about it being a family matter, about trust. She nodded slowly. She looked down at the file again. She dismissed the claim. Costs were awarded to me, not a large amount, but enough to cover most of Clifford's fees. She said that verbal assurances of financial support within families did not constitute enforceable promises, and that proceeding to a major financial transaction without documented confirmation of third-party funding was not reasonable reliance. That was it. We filed out into the corridor, and I stood for a moment by the tall windows that look out over Mulcaster Street, watching the February snow come down on the parked cars below. Clifford shook my hand and said he'd send the final invoice. Trevor walked past me without speaking. Ingrid stopped. She looked worn, in a way I hadn't seen since her mother was sick. She said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I put my hand on her arm. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Are you all right?" She shook her head very slightly, and in that small motion I understood that things between her and Trevor were not good, and that they had not been good for some time, and that the house had been the latest in a long series of things that were supposed to fix something that couldn't be fixed that way. I said, "You can always call me." She nodded and walked toward the elevator where Trevor was waiting. He didn't hold the door. That was 14 months ago. In June, Ingrid told me she and Trevor were separating. They are still in the process of sorting out the legal side of things. She's renting an apartment in Mississauga, near her school board office. She comes to Barrie once a month, and I make the lemon chicken, and we sit at the same kitchen table and talk, sometimes for hours. She told me once that she had known, when she said Trevor's not going to take this well, that she was warning me, that some part of her already knew who he was by then. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, I knew too. I knew, and I let it go because she loved him, and I wanted her to be happy, and sometimes those two things make you look away from what you can see clearly. Joel came back to Barrie in August, drove out from Kelowna with his family, and we had a weekend that felt like something coming back to life. His kids ran in the backyard where Ingrid used to chase fireflies. Buddy the dog tried to keep up and couldn't quite manage it. I watched from the back steps and thought about all of it. The phone calls, the registered envelope, the courtroom, the snow on the cars outside the window. I thought about Trevor saying, "You have more than enough. You're just choosing not to share it with your own family." He wasn't entirely wrong that I have enough. He was wrong about almost everything else. He was wrong about what family means. He was wrong about what enough is for. He was wrong to think that a man who spent 30 years building something careful and modest owed him access to it because he'd signed a document and put on a suit one Saturday in Collingwood. What I've come to understand, sitting on these back steps watching my grandchildren run, is that the money was never really the point. The money was just the clearest way to see it. When someone loves you, they don't file paperwork. When someone sees you as a resource, that's exactly what they do. I don't say any of this to Ingrid. She's doing the hard work of rebuilding, and she doesn't need my editorializing. But I say it here because I think there are other fathers sitting in houses like mine, watching their kids choose people who see them as balance sheets, and wondering if they're the problem for saying no. You're not the problem. Say no. Get it in writing when it matters, and never, ever let anyone tell you that protecting the life you built for yourself is the same thing as turning your back on your family. Helen would have told me that herself if she'd had the chance. I know it because I knew her, and because the look she would have given Trevor at that dinner table would have told the whole story before anyone said a word. I'm glad I finally listened to her, even this late.